Yeah, I think I'll read this one that mentions ice. It seems appropriate.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. A white Kia on the side of the highway. Inclement weather, interrogation, ICE agents, histories of mass incarcerations, of mass deportations, of mass liquidations. You can see the IHOP sign from here, the IKEA billboard, In-N-Out Burger from here, intensive care units, intensification of COVID-19 cases, high blood pressure, diabetes, a country incontinent, intravenous injections, infantilized by its infantry, by its infancy, by its illegitimacy. I drive along the Housatonic River as it crosses under Route 20 3 times. Stop sometimes to listen to the river, water, PCBs from the abandoned General Electric factory, now a Superfund site. Intolerable and inevitable. Cinder block architecture, Family Dollar, Dollar General, bioaccumulation in the birds, red-winged blackbirds, white-throated sparrows, blue jays, and brown-headed cowbirds. Night is up against whatever makes the owls so seldom afraid of the night. Goodwill stores abandoned, its windows dirty, for-lease signs and blood-red letters, the asphalt in the parking lot, a sheet of early ice.
Thanks for listening to Read Minnesota Books. I'm your host, Deborah Copperrood. I have a poet here today. Mark Nowak is an award-winning poet, social critic, and labor activist who teaches at Manhattanville University in Purchase, New York. He's the founding director of the Worker Writers School. His book, Coal Mountain Elementary, came out in 2009, and his 2004 book, Shut Up, Shut Down, was a New York Times editor's choice. He has been awarded fellowships from the Guggenheim, Lannan, and Creative Capital Foundations. His latest publication from Coffee House Press, titled Again, is out this spring. It's a photo text commentary on MAGAism in America. Mark, welcome to Read Minnesota Books.
Thanks for having me on.
What is your connection to Minnesota?
Well, I lived in Minnesota a really long time. I moved there in the early 90s. I think it was 1992. I got a teaching job at what's then College of St. Catherine, now St. Catherine University. There used to be a Minneapolis campus on Franklin Avenue over by the university. And so I taught there for about 15 or 16 years until I eventually moved back to New York State, where I'm from. So I spent, a really long time there, edited a magazine there, have been published since then by Coffee House Press in Minneapolis. And I miss being there, and I can't wait to come back this spring.
Nice. Tell me about your latest project again. And the title, do I say dot, dot, dot again, or ellipses again, or just again?
You can say whatever you want. I'm just calling it again. But the 3 dots before the word again kind of signal that it's an erasure of the acronym Make America Great Again. It's just the word again. And the book is 5 seasonal poems, begins with fall and then goes through winter, spring, summer, and then fall again. And it's kind of a documentary of just kind of living through from the 2020 elections until the re-election in 2024. So the first poem is about kind of the rural landscapes around me during that first election. The second poem, Winter, is on January 6th at the US Capitol. The third sequence, Spring, is about the white nationalist mass shooting in my hometown of Buffalo at the Top supermarket. Then Summer, about the attempted assassination of Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania on the campaign trail. And then a final closing piece that leads up to Trump's reelection. And I should say that they are all Abecedarian poems, which is a poem in alphabetical order. So the first poem you see in the book is kind of focused on the letter A, and each page goes A to Z for each sequence.
Nice. I really found it very affecting. I loved reading it, but also I hated it because it's like such a dismal
Yeah.
chapter in our country's history. So I found the poems devastating, but also funny, which is my favorite combination. How do you achieve that tone? What's your secret?
Well, the subject matter is pretty horrific to begin with, right? And then, but something about the Abecedarian, for me at least, is it feels like it brings about wordplay. There's a lot of wordplay in the book, which this comes through. That in like the very first poem, there's a Family Dollar, Dollar General play to the Attorney General, Joint Chiefs of Staff, muscle aches, a leave, right? So there's a lot of space there, I think, for kind of verbal play. And maybe that's what comes together. It's also really kind of musical form, because if you're going through and thinking about every word that begins with, I don't know, the letter J, for example, right? You sort of have this built-in musicality of alliteration and consonants happening in the poem that is just there by the very way we choose to put those poems together, right? And it's also a little bit like our first learning experiences, when you're sitting on the lap of your parents or your older siblings and they've got the ABC reader out, right? It kind of almost harkens back to that a little bit. A is for apple, B is for bear. It's something about that form itself that I think is allows for both serious critique and playfulness at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. Did you set out to write Abecedarian poems, or did that form find you as you worked?
No, I didn't, I hadn't, my previous book of poems, I'd written like a critical book, edited some anthologies in between, was actually 2009. So it was 17 years ago. And I really had kind of stopped writing. And then during the COVID pandemic, I kind of live in a rural area. I would kind of wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning and I would hear the owls outside and they were having these huge conversations. There were a lot of owls by me. And so I just wrote a couple of pieces and it felt like, oh, that's a poem about the letter O. And then I wrote a couple other things and I was like, oh, this is kind of about the letter D. And then a couple others is about the letter T. I'm wondering if I could fill in the rest of the alphabet. And then when I wrote one, I was kind of exhausted. And then January
Mm,
6th happened and I was like, well, how am I going to write this? I already have one 26-page Abecedarian. I wonder if I could do it again. And so I just started looking through, I had watched it in kind of horror happening live. Uh,
yeah.
and then I went back to C-SPAN, which just has like a camera, mounted camera, and you just see it from the same angle for like 8 or 10 hours. And I kept watching that, thinking about the alphabet and thinking about what kind of words I saw, there's a flag poem in there that's all the flags people were carrying, alphabetizing all of that. So it just developed kind of, then after I had two, I knew like, okay, this is now a book of Abecedarians. But it didn't start that way, but it kind of developed during the process.
Sure. That's great. I have questions about the spring section. So this is a audio medium, so I'm going to try to describe it. On each page, there's a poem in black letters with a lot of space in between. And in that space, there's gray text that's like when I first read it, I thought it was like an inventory from a big box outdoor recreation store that sells guns, like maybe a Shields or Gander Mountain. The fall again section has the same visual experience. And then your acknowledgement section answered my questions about what was that grayscale text. But I wanted to know from you about your creative process. Like when you create that kind of a poem, what's the, how do you go about creating that visual experience? Do you know what you're going for from the beginning?
Yeah, no. So I never know. Well, I rarely know what I'm going for from the beginning. So in this case, I started researching, I remember it was my wife's birthday, and we were lying in bed and we had CNN on, and the story broke from my hometown that there was a mass shooting at the top supermarket. And when I started researching what had happened, I found out that the uh, shooter, a young man, had been kind of radicalized in white nationalism online. And he
Hmm.
had published published a 186-page manifesto. He lived like near Binghamton, New York, in my congressional district, actually, New York 19, and drove several hours west to Buffalo because he had done a search, like a demographic search on and a field trip, like he had actually gone there a couple of months earlier, about where he could find the most dense public space where Black people were gathered together, and he targeted that area. And so the text that you mentioned in the grayscale is actually, he did a lot of online searching for like, camouflage clothing and scopes and flak jackets and ammunition. And so I took everything that he researched online and made a huge alphabetical list of it because I'd been working on these abecedarians. And then instead of like an erasure poem just erasing it, I wanted
Hmm.
it to be kind of the backdrop of it because both in that poem and the last poem, does a similar thing with alphabetizing hate groups around the United States from a list of lists at the Southern Poverty Law Center and other places. I wanted people to be able to see, but barely be able to see how much time and energy had gone into planning out this really spiteful, hateful attack, right? I didn't want to just cover it up like an erasure poem. I wanted it to be there in like a light grayscale. So you could just read the poem in the darker font, but you could also see how it weaves through this just kind of immense 26-page list of him searching out how to, go into a supermarket in my hometown and just open fire on the people who were shopping that day.
Yeah, devastating.
Mhm.
Devastating. I have a much lighter question now.
Yeah.
There's a trailer for the book. How did you go about making that?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. One, I am obsessed with documentary film. I probably try to watch one, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 a week, something like that.
Oh,
And so
wow.
just the idea of the trailer in cinema is something like I really love. And then I was also an electronic musician, so I was used to mixing things, kind of putting sound and text and found audio all together, and using a mixing board and doing that. And so I kind of want, I'm a poet, so I don't have like a big New York City publishing house budget, so I had to do it myself. So I just took some of the images from the book, an audio track I had made, but that's kind of really influenced by this band Throbbing Gristle, and so a little bit of the text from the book, and just wove it together into I don't know, it's less than a minute and a half, maybe a minute and a quarter or something. Trailer for the book that shows a few photos, has a little bit of the text, has this kind of eerie soundtrack for it that I put together and give some information on its release. So I was super happy. And the books themselves are really inspired by documentary film. So to
Okay.
have a trailer for a documentary poetry book felt like in keeping with the documentary film tradition.
I will link to the trailer in the show notes so everybody can watch it.
Thank you.
What is your favorite part of the writing process? Do you like to draft or revise or read aloud?
Uh, I think publishing is my favorite part of the process. Everything else is incredibly difficult and time consuming, as everyone who does that knows. Um, I hate proofreading. I hate that stage of it. I would much rather be and I kind of hate initial drafts as well because you often feel so lost in the process and you have no idea where it's going. So maybe that middle stage of kind of editing and revising where you at least have some material to work with and you're trying to figure out its final shape and improve it as it goes along. At least I feel like I'm going somewhere then, rather than just like when I'm first putting it together, I feel like I'm just on Google Maps and I don't know where I'm going, right?
Hmm.
At least when I'm doing that revising and editing, I feel like okay, it's telling me I could go these five different ways from city A to city B. Which route do I want to take? What kind of places might I stop along the way? Like I at least have that kind of sense of the journey.
Yeah, that's a great analogy for the revision process. I like that.
Yeah.
Who is your favorite Minnesota poet?
Oh, I'm gonna just go with Minnesota writer. I mean, there's so many great writers in the Twin Cities right now. It would be hard to choose. I love Kao Kailia Yang. In a journal I had, I published a really early section of The Late Homecomer before it came out when I was still living in Minnesota. But I think probably the most influential writer of all time for me from Minnesota was the late, great Meridel LeSueur. I mean, I read and studied her work so closely in the early and mid 90s, and she has this trio of books that people don't know that came out in the kind of late 30s, early 1940s. The first was a little novel called The Girl, which is really great. Then she did this collection of short stories called Salute to Spring. That was fantastic. And then a kind of unique WPA era history of Minnesota called North Star Country. I think those three books together, coupled with her own focus on the labor movement and the working class and strikes in Minnesota during that era, just became, when I was kind of first starting like out of grad school, these ideas of how I might start putting books together and publishing them was just a tremendous, tremendous influence on my work to this day.
That's a fantastic recommendation. I have not heard of her, so that's
Mm,
great. I will immediately look her up after this.
absolutely.
Are you writing anything new about the current political situation?
I'm still trying to figure out where I go next. I did put out a couple of years ago another book on it was a reprint of the first ever Black Arts Movement workshop in a prison in the United States, which happened at Attica after the Attica uprising with Celeste Tisdale, who went to Attica in 72, 73, 74. Put out this book by Dudley Randall's Broadside Press. It was the great Black Arts Movement press out of Detroit. And it was a big book in the 70s, but then it kind of fell out of print. And Celeste and I brought it back into print. I wrote the introduction to the book. It's out from Duke University Press. It's called When the Smoke Cleared. So I encourage people to check that out. And so I'm doing a lot of like kind of smaller essays and maybe a book on prison writing in the 1970s and kind of studying it as a kind of precursor to today's abolition movement and how prison writers in the 70s started to develop the language of abolition in their poems. So that's kind of one of a couple frying pans on the stove at the current moment.
Nice. Before I forget, what was the name of the journal that you published part of the Late Homecomer in?
Oh, so I edited when I was at St. Kate's a journal called XCP, Cross Cultural Poetics, and it's actually completely digitized both at the websites of the University of Pennsylvania and Northwestern University. So if you just type in XCP, Cross Cultural Poetics, it will take you to one of those two websites, and you can look at and read and download PDFs of any of the I don't know, 20 something issues of the journal.
Okay, great. You're coming to Minneapolis in May, right?
Yeah, I am going to be in Minneapolis on May 12th at Moon Palace, reading from the new book. So I would love to see anybody listening in there at the event. I'll also, the week before that, be on KFAI on Right On Radio. So you can listen to me on the podcast. You just can listen to this podcast. You can listen to me on the radio and then come out to Moon Palace and say hello.
Perfect. And where can folks follow you online?
Oh, I run an organization that does poetry workshops for trade unionists. I mentioned that Meridel LeSueur connection. And I have since I started actually doing these workshops in Minnesota. at the Ford plant that used to exist down on Ford Parkway in
Oh,
St. Paul,
yeah.
closing. And I did, when they announced they were closing with the UAW, the United Auto Workers, I was teaching poetry workshops actually inside the Ford plant. And so that became the Worker Writer School, which has been going now for almost, well, actually 20 years now has been going. And so on Instagram, we're at Worker Writer School. That's me and stuff that we're doing with different trade unions and worker centers around the US, mostly in New York City, but we have a former SEIU kitchen worker from a hospital down in southern Minnesota. We have people in Texas and the Philippines, all around the country, all around the world, actually, in these workshops. You can find out more there. Worker Writer School on Instagram.
Wonderful. I'll link to that in the show notes as well. Well, thank you so much, Mark, for being on the Read Minnesota Books podcast. It's been great to speak with you.
Thanks so much for having me.
And now for my recommendations. Let's all go look up Meridel LeSueur. That was a great recommendation from Mark. And I'm going to recommend book trailers. I have to admit, I'd never watched a book trailer before I watched the trailer for Again, but there are whole YouTube channels dedicated to book trailers. I will link to the book trailer channel in the show notes. I'm not a huge YouTube person, but I will go on YouTube to watch book content for sure. And that concludes this episode of Read Minnesota Books. Thanks for listening. Stay safe. Goodbye, friends.